Unfortunately, my Republican colleagues, at the direction of Donald Trump, decided that they would rather have this chaos at the border than to actually solve some of the problems. Instead of actually participating in negotiations on legislation, they spent the last couple months trying to impeach the Secretary of Homeland Security. And one of their arguments is that he was violating the law in failing to detain everyone who came over the border and would be subject to detention. In your experience working for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is it actually feasible to detain everyone who would qualify under that statute?
Sir, we're talking about the detention of hundreds of thousands of individuals. Just the safety risks alone, logistics, staffing, security, et cetera, it would be monumental in hundreds of billions of dollars.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank our witnesses for being here. I just came in a minute ago, Mr. O'Brien, but you said that the president has the authority to shut down the border right now. Under what authority do you refer to?
As I said, Section 1182F of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which was the statutory provision that was at issue in Trump v. Hawaii. It's a provision that allows the president by proclamation to temporarily suspend the admission of certain classes of aliens into the United States.
So why didn't Donald Trump use that?
He did. That's why the Trump v. Hawaii case went all the way to the Supreme Court.
But then why was it relied on Title 42?
Well, there was a pandemic on. I mean, Title 42 is pitched at a very different set of circumstances. It's specifically at a public health crisis. 1182F is pitched at a general power to manage the border in confrontation of a crisis.
Mr. Hauser, what's your response to that?
Sir, the idea, operationally, from my personal experience, the idea of shutting down the border, one, puts a grave risk of death for the migrants that are being transited towards the border and those that are seeking asylum. Additionally, it does put Border Patrol in sort of operational challenges to sort of continue to control the flow as it would come towards the border. That's not a panacea that would solve the problem that we're seeing across the Western Hemisphere that's causing the problem. You know, notably, an example is if you look at the increase of encounters over the last 2 to 3 years, as we've seen, which are very significant, the delta between the encounter numbers between the Trump administration and the Biden administration really are from 2 or 3 or 4, sort of the large bulk of them from 3 countries, Cuba, Venezuela, and Colombia. So for instance, in the last, between fiscal years 22 and 23, 470,000 Cubans were moved into were brought into the country through the asylum process. The idea that you would have had those populations continue to back up in Mexico is a drastic situation that would be a huge humanitarian crisis. Additionally, you look at the idea that the full expulsion of these populations at those numbers are unrealistic operationally.
So, and I think that's an important point because we had the Remain in Mexico policy when there were more than 13,000 migrants who were left on the border in Mexico and suffered from some sort of violent crime, which is part of the reason why President Biden led a bipartisan group to reach a legislative solution to this problem. And one of the things that that bill did was dramatically changed the asylum process because I think everyone agrees that a 5 to 7 year lag time on an asylum application is unacceptable. Unfortunately, my Republican colleagues, at the direction of Donald Trump, decided that they would rather have this chaos at the border than to actually solve some of the problems. I want to turn to a couple things in that. I read, and I assume you would know this, that ICE may have to cut detention beds because it is underfunded. Is that correct?
I read that in the media too as well, right. Sir. That's my only knowledge of that.
Right. And in this bipartisan bill, it would have significantly funded ICE for additional detention beds, right?
That, from the proposal, sir, that I have read in that bipartisan approach, yes. Just to the point I made earlier, of those that, the key question, I think, and challenge is the removability of people once their legal pathways are no longer there to stay in this country. You're saying in the last, just for example, in the last 3 to 4 years, 1.3 million Cubans have sought asylum here in this country and left communist Cuba. There's some stats that show at least 20% of the Cuban population are on the move across the Western Hemisphere. There's absolutely no way to sort of upend and pull those asylum seekers and refugees and that community up out of their communities and sort of detain them until we have the foreseeable, reasonable ability to remove them back to communist Cuba. That's just for one example, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence, and I think the point that you're making is that we need additional funding in order to comply with the law. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce 2 documents into the record by unanimous consent.
Sure.
The first is a press release from the USCIS, which documents that in fiscal year 2023.
You know, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to object to that. If I want to read it, I'll read it. If he's going to put it in, he should read the title, and that's it. Yeah, he's already.
This is not on my time.
Yeah, no, I know that, but I don't know that you need to read it to me.
I'm reading the title.
No, you weren't.
Completing an unprecedented 10 million immigration cases in fiscal year 2023, USCIS reduced its backlog for the first time in over a decade by 15%. And the other article I would like to introduce is by Mr. Hauser, entitled "The GOP's Border Proposals Are a Human Trafficker's Dream." And I yield back.